Theon Greyjoy was 10 years old when he was first brought to Winterfell as a hostage and ward, a trembling boy with the pale salt wind of the Iron Islands still clinging to his ragged clothes. He had glared at the north with something like wounded pride, uncertain whether to cast himself as a subdued captive or a silent conqueror in waiting. But Winterfell was no mere fortress. Its great gray walls, the steep towers, the quiet godwood with its ancient heart tree all shaped Theon's understanding of the North into something finer and more complex than the bitter lessons he had learned at Pike. Slowly, year by year, he carved out a place for himself in the Stark household, forging a bond with Robb that was as close as brothers, though neither boy could ever name precisely the day or the moment when that happened. He remembered running the practice yard with Robb, the clang of dull steel from the blunted training swords and the fresh tang of straw dummies beaten into ragged shapes. They would both be out of breath, laughing, stinging with bruises. Every passing month proved to Theon that if the sea demanded one's loyalty through tides and storms, the land demanded it through patient endurance. Theon had been flung upon the North's rocky shores by fate, but it wasn't long before he discovered that he was not only expected to stay, but to belong, albeit in his own unusual way. A piece of him would always remember Pike with longing, its jagged cliffs, the crash of wind and wave, the black silhouette of that forbidding keep. But another piece of him learned to love the stark silhouettes of Winterfell's towers, the hot pools and hidden passages. He discovered the quiet hush of the crypts, the stories of the ancient kings in the north. He found, surprisingly, that he could feel at home there. Years passed, carrying Theon and Robb from boyhood to young adulthood. Lord Eddard Stark was a father to them both in his measured, solemn way, perhaps not as affectionate with Theon as he was with his own sons, but fair. It was that sense of fairness, that sense of belonging to something honorable that lingered in Theon's mind. After all, he had once been taught that Ironborn fought for their honor on the prow of a longship, that the old ways demanded reaving, taking, proving your place with blood and iron. But honor meant something different in the north, something sterner, yes, but also gentler and more constant. Eddard Stark could be as unyielding as the bar of a new-forged sword, yet he also seemed to embody a quieter kind of heroism. He nurtured and protected, just as the old pines of the Wolfswood protected the life beneath their needled boughs. Perhaps that was why, when Lord Eddard rode south to serve as Hand of the King, Theon felt a sliver of dread he could not quite shake. It was not fear for himself, he was near-grown and more sure of his place now than he had been as a child. But for Robb, for the family that Theon had come to see as his own, however complicated that might be, Robb was left behind to act as the Stark in Winterfell, an inexperienced young lord who had to suddenly command a great region with its own proud traditions. Theon tried to offer counsel, or at least camaraderie, and Robb accepted both in stride, trusting Theon as his friend and closest confidant. The old days of the practice yard were behind them, yet in some ways they had never truly departed. Every time Theon corrected a younger guard in their stance or teased Bran about his archery, he recalled those sweaty afternoons with Robb, that sense of fierce camaraderie they had honed over the years. News traveled slowly then. Whispers of trouble in King's Landing reached them, distant and uncertain, like the wind blowing off some foreign sea. Yet soon enough, ravens came carrying dark tidings. Lord Eddard had been branded a traitor, arrested, threatened by the Lannisters. Robb's resolve steeled itself into something even Theon had not quite expected. He saw, in his friend's gray eyes, the first inklings of that lordly presence that would come to define Robb Stark, young in years, perhaps, but old enough to bear the weight of the entire North upon his shoulders. The time for war arrived swiftly. Robb called his banners to meet the threat of the Lannisters. Eddard was still being held in King's Landing, and the rumor was that Sansa and Arya were captive as well. Theon could see the fear in Catelyn Stark's face, the anguish of a mother who would do anything to protect her children. And so the armies of the North assembled under the direwolf sigil, the men hard and determined. Theon rode among them, exulting in the clash of steel, in the calls of the horns. War was frightening, yes, but it was also a chance to prove loyalty, to stand beside Robb and avenge the betrayal done to the man who had treated Theon more fairly than his own father ever had. The sea still called to him sometimes in his dreams. He would dream of standing on a ship's deck, the salt spray in his hair, calling out to the drowned god with that old defiance. But each morning he awoke in the encampments of the northern host, feeling the crunch of leaves and pine needles under his boots, the swirl of cold air around him, and seeing Robb conferring with his bannermen. In those moments, Theon knew that his loyalty belonged here. He was a Greyjoy by birth, but by every measure of brotherhood and experience, he was Robb's man. The thought was disquieting at times. He would wonder if the men of the Iron Islands would call him a craven for bending the knee to a wolf. But war was upon them all, and Theon had come to value Robb's brand of leadership. If that meant ignoring the call of Pike, so be it. And so it went. The victories came. Theon fought alongside the great Jon and Roose Bolton and other northern lords who regarded him with curiosity, grudging respect, sometimes suspicion. But he soon proved himself. He was quick with a bow, adept at skirmishing, and fearless in a cavalry charge. Theon's valor did not go unnoticed by the northern commanders. More importantly, it did not go unnoticed by Robb, who would clasp Theon's shoulder after a battle and give him a nod of gratitude. That small gesture meant more to Theon than all the gold or praise he could have found in the Iron Islands. When word came that Eddard Stark had been executed by King Joffrey, the northern host was plunged into grief and fury. The men looked to Robb, but they also saw Theon at his side, unflinching, eyes bright with anger. Theon burned with it. He had watched Ned Stark treat him with the same fairness a father might, even if Theon was no true son. To see that life snuffed out by Lannister cruelty stoked Theon's wrath until it was a roaring tide within him. It was then that the North declared Robb Stark the king in the North, a moment that sparked an awe in Theon he could hardly describe. He knelt along with the rest, bowing his head, proclaiming the rightful king of the North. In that thunderous acclamation, Theon felt the last tenuous tether to Pike's strain. If the old ways demanded that you take what is yours, then Theon was here taking his own destiny, forging it by pledging fealty to Robb. They marched south. Theon accompanied Robb in a campaign that saw victory after victory against the Lannisters. Even so, the war was not won, and the men began to mutter that reinforcements would be needed, or alliances forged, or else they would be ground down by the forces mustering in the south. One evening, in the midst of a muddy encampment on the fringes of the Riverlands, Robb called Theon aside with Catelyn Stark and several of the northern lords. The night was lit by torches and the faint flicker of distant campfires. "We need ships," Robb said, the strain evident in his voice. "Ships to help us secure the Neck, or to raid the Westerlands by sea. The Lannisters' power is too broad on land. A naval force would let us strike unexpectedly, make them fear for their coasts, force them to divide their armies." Theon listened, knowing exactly where this was leading. The last time he had seen Pike, he had been a child of 10, newly taken to the north. Now he was a man grown, standing in front of his friend and king, weighed by expectation. Robb continued, "You know the Iron Islands. You know Balon Greyjoy. He might be persuaded to join us. The Lannisters have done nothing for the Ironborn. The islands might be enticed by gold, or promises of autonomy, or the chance to reeve under our banner. If anyone can win Balon's support, it would be you, Theon." For a moment, Theon felt a lurch inside his chest. He recalled how the Ironborn had once rebelled, how Ned Stark had put down that rebellion. Balon Greyjoy's own sons had died in that revolt, except for him. Theon was the last surviving son of Balon Greyjoy, living as a ward under the roof of the very man who broke his father's rebellion. Returning to Pike would not be a simple matter. He knew it might reopen old wounds, that his father might scorn him as a wolf's pup rather than an Ironborn prince. The scorn itself might be lethal if Theon did not tread carefully. "I'll go," Theon said in a voice calmer than he felt, determined to be the man Robb needed him to be. "For you, Robb." Robb's eyes met his, and Theon saw gratitude there, and something else, the acceptance of a risk. "I trust you," said the king in the north. "I know you'll do right by us." Theon left the camp the next morning, accompanied by a handful of men loyal to Robb. The roads of the Riverlands were splattered with mud and run through with refugees fleeing the war. Smoke from burnt farms still hung in the air, and Theon's heart grew heavy. War might have its glories, but it also came with heartbreak and ruin for the common folk. This was no reaving expedition that would end in a bag of loot. This was a conflict that would shape the future of the Seven Kingdoms. Theon carried that weight in his saddlebag along with his spare clothes and dagger. When he finally stood on the deck of a merchant vessel bound for Lordsport, gazing at the Iron Islands looming on the horizon, Theon felt an odd mixture of dread and resolution. Pike's towers were as jagged as knives, black silhouettes against a stormy sky. The smell of brine and seaweed struck him like a half-forgotten memory. Theon could hear the gulls screeching, the waves pounding the rocks below. He was home, yet it felt less like a homecoming and more like stepping into an old dream turned sour. Balon Greyjoy received him coolly in the ancient, salt-worn hall of Pike. The torches guttered in iron sconces, their smoky glow barely holding back the darkness. The tapestry of House Greyjoy with its golden kraken hung on the wall, looming like some watery monster threatening to swallow all who dared step near. Balon sat at the far end of a driftwood table, gray hair straggling around a sharp, salt-etched face. His eyes were cold as he regarded his son for the first time in nearly a decade. You return a stranger, Balon said, his voice like the rasp of iron chains. Dressed in wolf's clothing, riding behind the wolf's banners. You come to me now with war on every shore and expect me to kneel to your boy king. Theon swallowed, steeling himself. It was as he had feared. His father took him for a supplicant, for a hostage repeating the commands of his captor. But Theon was not that boy any longer. He took a breath and let the familiarity of Pike's wet stone floors drift from his mind. Instead, he recalled the strong voice of Robb Stark, the steady fairness of Ned. He remembered how it felt to stand side by side with the Northern Lords and fight for a cause he believed in. Now he needed to channel all that if he was going to sway Balon. I ask you to ally, Theon said, meeting his father's hardened gaze. King Robb Stark has no desire to crush the Iron Islands. He remembers well how Robert Baratheon forced your surrender, how the North bled you. But we offer a chance for the Ironborn to reave Lannister coasts, to take spoils, to join a war that will see House Lannister brought to its knees. We'll give you autonomy under your own banner if the North wins its freedom. You fought for independence once. Now, the North fights for independence too. Silence lingered. Balon's eyes flickered, calculating. A faint sneer twisted his lips. The Ironborn follow the old way, he said. We take what is ours. We do not ask. Why should we fight beneath the wolf's banner? Theon took a step forward. Because this time we won't lose. The Lannisters are vulnerable, fighting on multiple fronts. The old way teaches us to strike when we see advantage. I bring you that advantage. Let us strike their coasts, harry their ships. The gold of Casterly Rock is not on the sea, it's in the mines. But they must protect their ports, their shipping lanes. We can disrupt their supply lines, drain their coffers, force them to scatter. Balon stared at him for a long moment. In that heavy pause, Theon recalled the endless nights he had spent as a boy, awake in Winterfell, wondering if his father ever thought of him. Now here he was, a grown man, not quite belonging to either realm. But Theon refused to yield to the old man's scorn. Robb trusted him. The North believed in him. So Theon stood his ground. At last, Balon let out a huff that might have been a bitter laugh. You speak well for a wolf's pup. He rose, sending shadows dancing along the walls. But I will not kneel. Tell your king in the North that if he wants our ships, he shall have them, provided we take our portion. The Iron Isles will not bow to him, but we will fight beside him for a price. Lands along the western coast, or gold enough to drown 1,000 men. Theon, you will be my messenger. Tell him this, if we fight the Lannisters, we do so as allies, not as subjects. Theon inclined his head, controlling the relief that threatened to break across his face. I'll tell him. But the king in the North is fair. Strike a better tone, father, and you might find him more generous than you expect. Balon's eyes glittered in the torchlight, but he said no more. Theon was dismissed, free to linger in Pike's cold halls as long as he wished, so long as he understood that his father neither trusted him nor welcomed him. A sister's voice startled him that evening when he found Asha waiting in a dim corridor, arms crossed, smirk teasing at her lips. They had not seen each other in years, and the gap between them was as wide as the sunset sea. She made a barb about him smelling of wolf dung, and Theon returned a small grin, trying to mask the swirl of mixed emotions. So the wolf sends you to treat with us. How loyal you've become, she teased, eyes sharp. Loyal to those who've earned my loyalty, he answered. If father has any sense left in his stubborn head, he'll see that fighting beside the North is the best chance for the Iron Islands to gain anything from this war. You reave, you raid, you capture Lannister ships. We share in the spoils, we weaken our common foe. Asha studied him with calculating interest. You've changed, Theon. I've had to, he said, and left it at that. He stayed a fortnight in Pike, verifying the agreement with Balon's captains, ensuring that a small fleet would set sail soon for Seaguard to join with the northern forces. It was not an alliance born of love or trust, but Theon could see the gleam in the Ironborn's eyes. They relished the chance to burn and pillage, to strike where their foes were weakest. If Robb Stark kept his word to grant them certain freedoms or spoils, the old Iron Lords would likely fall in line. They cared for the old way, but they cared more for victory and silver. All the while, Theon felt the old ache. Pike was in his blood, the crash of waves lulled him to memories of childhood. Yet he also found that the island felt too narrow, too bitter. At night, he longed for the hush of the Godwood, the stable warmth of Winterfell's hearth. The change in himself was undeniable. Perhaps he was a man caught between two worlds, but the cause he believed in belonged in the North. When the day came for him to depart, he spared Asha a brief embrace, a sign of familial warmth that felt awkward but necessary. She grinned crookedly, telling him to mind his step in the wars to come and not to let the wolves devour him. Back in the Riverlands, Theon found Robb's host had shifted west, angling toward the strategic fords that would allow them to threaten the Lannister forces under Tywin or Jaime. Theon arrived with news of Balon's conditional alliance. Robb listened carefully, as did Catelyn Stark and the lords assembled in council. Mutterings rose at the mention of Balon Greyjoy's demands, but in the end, Robb placed his faith in Theon's judgment. He decided to accept the alliance, to promise the Iron Islands certain benefits if and only if they truly supported his war effort. Theon felt a wash of gratitude that Robb did not question his loyalty or suspect he had been turned by Pike. "It's a dangerous gamble," Roose Bolton observed with his usual quiet intensity. "Who is to say the Krakens won't turn around and strike us the moment it suits them?" "It is a gamble," Theon allowed, "but I believe they'll keep to the deal. The Ironborn thirst for spoils and renown, and they have no reason to love the Lannisters, who hold no ports to share with them. If we keep them to the seas, they can't cause us trouble on land." Robb nodded, his eyes flickering with the cool logic that grew sharper every day. "We've enough enemies on land to worry about. Let the Ironborn provide the distraction at sea. We'll remain vigilant, but for now every strike at the Lannisters serves our cause." Catelyn regarded Theon, a mother's concern for the son she lost and the son she gained etched into her features. He met her eyes, but she said nothing. Perhaps she believed that the measure of trust Ned Stark had placed in Theon should remain unbroken. Or perhaps she simply understood that this was war and one took allies where one could. The conflict raged on. Theon found himself engaged in more skirmishes, often leading small bands of scouts or outriders. He proved adept at moving swiftly across rugged terrain, gleaning intel from local villages and anticipating the Lannisters' movements. When news came that a portion of the Lannister fleet had been harried at sea by unknown reavers, Theon took pride. Balon's ships had made their first move, it seemed, and that forced the Lannisters to dispatch some of their power to defend the western coast. It meant less pressure on the northern forces in the Riverlands. Yet war was never simple. Raventree Hall was under threat and Robb led a daring rescue. Theon fought beside him, arrow after arrow loosed with deadly aim, dropping Lannister archers and men-at-arms. There was a moment amidst the chaos when Theon found himself back-to-back with Robb, their blades whirling. It was not the playful sparring of their youth, but the life-and-death struggle of grown men. The ring of steel, the cries of the dying, the stench of blood, this was not a glorious tapestry, but a savage display of how quickly a mortal coil could be broken. Yet in that swirl, Theon felt an unspoken bond with Robb, the same sense of belonging he had first tasted all those years ago in Winterfell's courtyard. When the Lannisters finally broke, Theon joined in the pursuit, but Robb recalled him, reminding him they needed living prisoners to glean information. Theon, breathless and splattered with mud, nodded his understanding. It was that sense of measured control that separated Robb from the more reckless lords. The young king was forging a reputation for decisive leadership tempered by justice. And Theon, by standing at his side, was forging a new sense of self, a Greyjoy indeed, but also a sworn man of the North. Time passed in a blur of marches, councils, and battles. Theon found himself in the thick of the war's swirl, loyal as he'd promised. Lord Tywin Lannister was rumored to be gathering a massive host, and the North braced itself for a fierce confrontation. Yet matters were further complicated by the news that Renly Baratheon had been killed by some dark sorcery, and Stannis Baratheon was laying siege to King's Landing. Suddenly, the realm was on the brink of fracturing entirely. Theon recalled the days of Robert's rebellion, though he had been but a child. Now, a new rebellion was shaping up, one with multiple claimants, shifting alliances, and no certain victor. Theon heard whispers of how these times would reshape the entire map of Westeros. A raven brought word of a huge Lannister force heading north to meet Robb in open battle. They would attempt to lure him into a trap or at least force him into a direct fight. Robb Stark gathered his lords and planned with meticulous care. "We'll draw them into the Whispering Wood," he said one night in the candlelit war tent. "Half our host will lie in wait, hidden among the thick of the forest, while the other half provides the bait. When the Lannisters think we're vulnerable, they'll charge. That's when we close the trap." Theon looked over the maps, adrenaline thrumming. He recalled the earlier success in the Whispering Wood, where Jaime Lannister had been captured. This would be a larger-scale version, more complex and more dangerous. Sure enough, the day of battle dawned in a hazy swirl of fog and faint sunlight. The tall pines and oaks of the Whispering Wood towered like silent witnesses to the swirling chaos that was about to break. Theon found himself among the archers hidden in the trees. He felt his heart thudding in his chest. He could see glimpses of the approaching Lannister columns, bright red and gold banners peeking through the foliage. War horns sounded, men shouted orders, and the clang of arms echoed through the wood. Robb's strategy held. The decoy force lured the Lannisters into overextending. Then the horns of the hidden Northmen blared in unison. Theon, along with hundreds of archers, loosed a volley of arrows into the unsuspecting knights. Horses screamed and men toppled from saddles. The rest of the hidden force rushed out, swords flashing in the broken sunlight. Chaos enveloped the wood. Theon knocked arrow after arrow, each shot guided by muscle memory and the calm concentration hammered into him from years of training. He glimpsed Robb riding into the fray, gray wind bounding by his side, a flash of gray fur and snapping jaws. It was vicious, the sounds of steel biting into flesh, the reek of blood mingling with the sharp tang of pine. The Lannister vanguard collapsed under the Northerners' ambush, and Theon saw a line of gold-cloaked riders attempting to regroup deeper in the wood. He gestured to a handful of men. They followed him as he sprinted through the undergrowth, using the thick trunks as cover. Theon's next arrow felled a knight whose helm displayed a proud lion crest. The horse reared, screaming, blood sprang. Theon felt no exultation in that kill, only grim determination. Hours later, as the sun began its descent, the Lannister force was in shambles. Their rearguard had attempted a desperate stand near a shallow creek, but Robb's men had enveloped them from three sides. Trumpets of victory sounded across the battered forest. Prisoners were taken, the wounded were tended, and the dead were strewn among fallen leaves turned crimson with blood. Theon emerged from the wood, panting, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead. He found Robb dismounting from his horse, also breathing hard, gray wind prowling near. "You did it," Theon managed between breaths. "You smashed them." Robb offered a weary grin, spattered in mud and gore. He clasped Theon's forearm in a warrior's greeting, that bond reaffirmed through blood and battle. "We did it," he corrected. "This victory belongs to the North, all of us." Theon felt that warmth again, that sense that he had chosen correctly. The Iron Islands might be his birthplace, but Robb Stark's cause was his cause. For the rest of that night, they camped in a battered clearing not far from the site of the battle. There was a subdued camaraderie, a mixture of exhaustion and relief. They had won again, albeit at a cost. Dozens of good Northmen lay dead. Theon wandered the perimeter, checking on the watchers, speaking words of encouragement to the men. He noticed some of them nodded in respect when he passed. He was no longer Theon the ward, Theon the uncertain hostage. Now he was Theon Greyjoy, Robb Stark's man, a proven commander in the field. Meanwhile, the Ironborn had continued their raids along the western coast, drawing attention away. Reports reached the northern host that a Lannister reinforcement force had been diverted to deal with the threat of Greyjoy longships prowling the shores near Case. This effectively reduced the number of troops Tywin could send against Robb, giving the North the breathing room it desperately needed. The alliance was paying dividends. Theon allowed himself a fleeting smile at the irony. The Ironborn were saving the North from a crushing assault on land. If his father had any sense, he would see that he was indeed gaining spoils and a measure of vengeance on the Lannisters. But the realm's larger storms were still brewing. King's Landing was under threat by Stannis Baratheon, so the Lannisters had turned their focus to defending the Iron Throne. Word reached Robb that the Tyrells had now joined Joffrey Baratheon through marriage, forging a powerful alliance in the south. The new king in the north might have bested the Lannisters on multiple fields, but the tides of war constantly shifted. Catelyn Stark arrived from a mission to treat with Renly Baratheon's widow, Margaery Tyrell, only to find that alliance gone. She spoke gravely of dark magic on the wind of shadows and betrayals. Then there were rumors swirling about the Iron Throne planning a move against the North through traitors in the Riverlands. Through it all, Theon remained at Robb's side, helping him plot troop movements, providing counsel on naval matters, and riding in the vanguard for each engagement. The friendship they had forged as boys was now tempered by the fires of war, unspoken yet stronger than any vow. From that vantage, Theon also saw the burdens piling upon Robb. The young king worried over his sisters still held in King's Landing, over his brothers Bran and Rickon left in Winterfell, over the cost of each battle. Theon did what he could, volunteering for dangerous missions so Robb could focus on strategy. Where once Theon might have bragged or sought personal glory, now he acted with a different purpose. He had found a place, he intended to keep it. It was that sense of place and loyalty that made the next tidings all the harder to bear. A raven came from Castle Black. It told of wildling raiders gathering beyond the wall, of dire rumors that the walking dead were stirring in the far north. At first, Theon dismissed it as some ruse, but the letter bore the seal of the Night's Watch, and it was addressed to all the High Lords of Westeros. Some read it as a desperate plea from the Black brothers. Robb took it seriously. Eddard Stark had always instilled a respect for the Wall's concerns. If there was a true threat rising beyond the Wall, the North would be the first to suffer. But resources were stretched thin. War with the Lannisters continued, and the North was still vulnerable. Theon found himself increasingly worried about Winterfell. With so many of the main fighting men gone south, only a skeleton garrison protected the ancient seat of House Stark. He imagined how easy it could be for some opportunistic foe to slip in. Suddenly, he remembered the seething ambition on his father's face, the smug cunning of Asha. Yet if Balon Greyjoy had truly pledged his ships to harry the Lannisters, would he dare to invade the North? Theon shook his head. Even his father wasn't that foolish. Nevertheless, the days dragged into weeks, and the war ground on. Theon lost count of how many fights he had seen. The men grew weary. Roose Bolton offered to retake Harrenhal while the Great John pressed for more aggressive strikes in the Westerlands. Robb tried to balance it all, mindful of the limited manpower and the unpredictability of his southern foes. As the king in the north debated with his council, Theon stood at his back, silent and resolute. He rarely offered counsel in these larger strategic matters unless directly asked, for he knew the northern lords still regarded him with a trace of suspicion. But in private, Robb would sometimes seek Theon's perspective, like a brother leaning on another. That bond was tested unexpectedly. Word arrived in a battered raven's message that Balon Greyjoy was laying claim to the title of King of the Isles and the North, proclaiming he would carve out his own kingdom while the realm was distracted. According to the letter, Pike was preparing to strike not just at Lannister coasts, but at the north as well. Robb's face darkened like a thundercloud when he read the words aloud in council. The northern lords erupted in outrage, some demanding Theon's head for bringing a viper into their midst. Theon stood reeling, furious at his father's betrayal. He had left Pike believing they had struck a bargain to fight the Lannisters. That Balon would so quickly overreach and declare for himself was an outrage. The Great John roared that Theon was a traitor. Roose Bolton eyed him coldly. Catelyn stared at him with a sorrowful expression, as if recalling the day Ned had agreed to foster Theon. But Theon knew the truth. He had remained loyal to Robb, and he would continue to do so. He strode to Robb's side, voice quivering only slightly. "I knew nothing of this, Robb. You have my word. Balon might have agreed to fight the Lannisters, but it seems he had other designs. I am loyal to you. I'll fight my father's men if I must." Roose Bolton's lip curled. If this is true, the Ironborn might already be sailing for the Stony Shore or Moat Cailin. Who is to say they won't strike deeper into the north? Robb regarded Theon, searching his face for any hint of deception. Then, with deliberate calm, he said, "I believe you, Theon. I know you would not have counseled my father's death if you had known this was Balon's plan. But we have to deal with this threat. If the Ironborn invade the north while we're fighting here, our people will suffer. My brothers in Winterfell." He stopped, the horror of it pressing upon him. The north was huge but lightly defended. If Balon moved quickly, he could seize valuable ground, and that would leave the northern host divided between facing Lannisters in the south and Ironborn in the north. Robb looked to his council, the frustration and anger plain. He had, in good faith, granted the Ironborn a chance to raid Lannister lands, only for Balon to repay him with betrayal. "I'll go," Theon said into the tense silence. "Send me north with a force. I know how the Ironborn fight. I know their ships and their tactics. I can help repel them or at least slow them down until you can bring more men. Let me prove my loyalty where it matters most, defending the north. My father's men won't expect me to turn against them." A hush followed. The lords exchanged glances. Some seemed more willing to accept Theon's offer. Others glowered, mistrustful. Then Robb nodded firmly. "You'll have a detachment of men. We can't spare many, but enough to harass the Ironborn, perhaps help the local lords fortify their defenses. Go. Protect Winterfell, my brothers, the North, our homeland." Theon felt a swell of fierce pride at Robb saying our homeland. He bowed, swearing an oath before them all to fight the Ironborn invaders even if they bore the same banner he was born under. He knew it would mean cutting down men who might be his uncles, his cousins, the old reaving captains he had once admired as a boy. But loyalty was a choice, and Theon had already made that choice. He rode north with a mix of Umbermen, Karstarks, and some of the craggy hill fighters. Though it was only a few hundred strong, Theon believed they could move swiftly and catch smaller Ironborn parties by surprise. The journey was hard, crossing the war-torn Riverlands, skirting the Neck, and finally emerging into the familiar gloom of the North's swamps and bogs. Winterfell was further still, protected by leagues of forest and tundra. Raven's messages flew ahead, warning the local lords to watch for Ironborn longships creeping along the coasts. When Theon reached the Stark castle of Torrhen's Square, he found the surrounding lands already plundered by a small band of raiders. Smoke curled from blackened fields, and the people inside the keep eyed Theon's party with frightened confusion. The Lord of Torrhen's Square stepped out, battered from a previous skirmish, relief sparking in his eyes when he recognized the banner of the dire wolf rather than the kraken. They consolidated their forces there, swelling to perhaps 400 strong. Theon learned that a band of Ironborn had moved east after plundering, heading toward the direction of Winterfell. Quickly, Theon sent riders to warn the castellan. Though he had been told that Bran ruled in Winterfell as Robb's regent, Theon prayed the boy would remain safe behind its walls. Theon pressed onward with his small force, determined to intercept the raiders. They caught up to them near the fringes of the Wolfswood. It was a small group of Ironborn, perhaps 100 reavers. Though outnumbered, they fought with savage glee as if reaving the green lands was a sacred calling. Theon remembered those fierce ways, how the Ironborn believed paying the iron price was the only true measure of worth. But Theon had also learned other measures: loyalty, honor, brotherhood. He led the charge, yelling for the north, urging his men forward. Steel clashed. Theon's sword bit into the shoulder of a bearded Ironborn whose face twisted in disbelief at being struck by one who bore the name Greyjoy. They fought amid mossy trunks, the ground soft with decaying needles. Theon could smell sweat, blood, salt. He nearly stumbled when he recognized a reaver who had once been a deckhand on his uncle's ship, but there was no time for reflection. The fight raged on, brutal and short. The Ironborn, despite their ferocity, were pinned between Theon's men and a flank of Torrhen's Square riders. They died or scattered. In the aftermath, Theon gazed upon the fallen with a strange numbness. These were his people once. Now they lay stiffening among the pines of the Wolfswood. He had chosen this path, but it exacted a price he had never anticipated in full. Still, he reminded himself of what Balon Greyjoy had done, how he had turned on an ally, how he would have burned Winterfell if given the chance. If Theon's choice cost him his ties of blood, so be it. Honor demanded it. Tending to the wounded, Theon ordered his men to continue pressing west toward the coastline, hoping to intercept more raiders. If they could deny the Ironborn a safe landing, they could force them back to their ships. While he organized supply lines, Theon dispatched another messenger to Winterfell, urging them to remain alert, to reinforce the walls if needed. The memories of Winterfell's quiet courtyards and gentle streams pushed him onward, lending him resolve. He would not let Pike's cruelty defile the place that had taught him a new meaning of home. Over the next 2 weeks, Theon clashed with more bands of raiders across the northern coasts. Each skirmish was a bitter revelation of how far Balon's treachery extended. The old man had unleashed dozens of longships to ravage the shorelines. Certain smaller keeps fell without resistance, their inhabitants fleeing into the woodlands. Theon and his band had to be everywhere at once, something they could never accomplish. But they made the Ironborn pay for every step inland. He used his knowledge of Ironborn tactics to lay ambushes, to pick vulnerable landing sites, and to coordinate with local defenders. The men of the north began to speak of Theon with a grudging respect, for he knew precisely how these seaborne fighters thought, and he never faltered in his mission to oppose them. Tales reached him that other Ironborn fleets had tried to sail up the Saltspear to take Mott only to meet stiff resistance. Theon was relieved by that news. If Mott remained in Stark hands, the road south was denied to the reavers. Winterfell would be spared the worst of it. But Theon couldn't be certain that some cunning captain wouldn't attempt a bold stroke. He pressed on. Finally, Theon received word that Asha Greyjoy herself had landed near Deepwood Mott with a force, claiming it in the name of her father. If Asha was allowed to hold Deepwood Mott, she could entrench and threaten large swathes of the north. Theon recalled her mocking grin in Pike's halls and how she had teased him for living among wolves. If Asha had truly turned her sights on permanent conquest, she would be a formidable foe. She was cunning, charismatic, and beloved by her crew. Gathering what forces he could muster, Theon marched to relieve Deepwood Mott. He found the Ironborn well dug within the keep, having easily overrun its small garrison. Siege warfare was not the Ironborn's strong suit, but if they were inside, it meant Theon needed to flush them out. Day by day, he positioned archers and made attempts to scale the walls, only to be repulsed by the reavers. Asha herself appeared on the ramparts a few times, calling taunts down to him, questioning his loyalty, mocking him for turning on his blood. Theon ground his teeth in frustration, ignoring her jibes. "You can't hold this land," he shouted up at her once. "You'll starve come winter, or the Starks will break you." Asha laughed. "Winter? That's seasons away. The only thing that matters is the iron price, little brother. We've taken this keep, and soon we'll take more. Go crawling back to your Wolf King. Tell him Balon Greyjoy has come for his crown." Fury lit Theon's veins, but he controlled himself. He would not be goaded into a reckless assault. Instead, he bided his time, instructing the northern forces to encircle Deepwood Mott completely, blocking off any escape routes to the sea. Ironborn fought best at sea. Deny them their ships, starve them out, and eventually they would break. Inside, Asha probably knew she was in a precarious position, but she would hold on as long as she could. During that stalemate, Theon received a raven from Robb. It told of further successes in the Westerlands, but also of Tywin Lannister's abrupt shift eastward to face Stannis' threat at King's Landing, a maneuver that had allowed Joffrey Baratheon to remain on the throne. It spoke of possible negotiations with House Frey and the continuing importance of the Riverlands. The letter ended with a reassurance to Theon: "You do the North proud by defending it. Hold fast. The day shall come when we return home, victorious, to set right all that Balon Greyjoy has done." Theon read those words by firelight, feeling a rush of renewed determination. The next morning, he doubled his efforts, organizing a stealth attack to retake a postern gate. Under the cover of darkness, his men managed to scale a section of the walls that had been lightly guarded. Fighting broke out in the courtyard, savage and close quarters. Theon heard Asha's voice crying commands somewhere above, swords flashed in torchlight, and the reek of blood filled the crisp northern air. Step by step, Theon's men pushed forward. Theon himself cut down an Ironborn captain who lunged at him with a throwing axe. He recognized the man from his youth, a frequent visitor to Pike. Their eyes locked in a stunned moment of recognition. In that heartbeat, Theon saw the betrayal that ran both ways. Once they had been kindred, now mortal enemies. There was no room for sorrow. Theon's sword found the man's throat. He fell, choking on blood. The courtyard was soon littered with dead. Theon's men surged into the keep proper, cornering pockets of Ironborn who fought with wild desperation. Asha, realizing the keep was lost, attempted to rally her men for a breakout. She led them in a furious charge, hoping to smash through the ring of Northmen outside the walls and flee for the coast. Theon, panting, wounds stinging, mustered the last of his strength to lead the Northmen in repelling them. Under the eerie light of a half-moon, the final battle erupted outside Deepwood Mott. Shouts echoed in the cold night as Asha's men tried to hack a path to freedom. Theon met his sister in a swirl of blades, steel scraping steel, sparks dancing. Asha's face was set with grim determination. "You'd kill your own kin, Theon?" she snarled, pressing an attack that nearly knocked him off balance. "Kin?" Theon spat back, parrying her stroke. "What kin sets upon the very land that gave me shelter? You betrayed an alliance I forged in good faith." Asha's eyes blazed, and she answered him with a whirl of strikes. "You turned your back on us the moment you bowed to the wolves. Father saw it, I saw it. We Ironborn take what we need. The North was ripe for the taking." Their blades rang. Theon felt his arm tremble from the force of her blows. She was always the better swordsman, but he had the advantage of a stronger force behind him. Already more Ironborn were being overwhelmed by the Northmen. Some were throwing down their weapons, others fought to the bitter end. Asha lunged, and Theon twisted aside. With a surge of will, he slammed the hilt of his sword into her wrist, making her drop her blade. He pinned her against the half-broken gate, breath ragged. She glared up at him, defiant even in defeat. "Kill me," she hissed. "If you're so loyal to the wolves, end it." Theon hesitated. Even now, with blood pounding in his ears and the memory of her taunts fresh, he balked at murdering his sister in cold blood. She was defeated, her men scattering. He wrested a dagger from her belt, tossing it aside. "I'll not kill you," he said, his voice rough. "But you'll remain a prisoner until Robb Stark decides your fate." She spat blood. "You're a craven and a traitor, Theon Greyjoy." The words stung, but Theon only clenched his jaw, hauling her upright so his men could bind her hands. "You're the traitor," he managed, though the old feelings of Pike and brother-sister warmth twisted in his gut. "You betrayed the trust one placed in you. And you defied the king in the north. Now you'll answer for it." The last of the Ironborn in the courtyard were subdued. Deepwood Mott was back in northern hands, though battered. Theon's men let out a ragged cheer. They had retaken the keep, inflicted heavy losses on the invaders, and captured Asha Greyjoy herself. That was a major victory, one that would surely cripple the morale of the other raiding parties. Theon stood in the midst of the carnage, breathing heavily, the night wind biting at his exposed skin. It felt hollow to celebrate. The days that followed were a grim aftermath. Asha refused to speak to Theon except for the occasional barb thrown in contempt. Theon kept her guarded at all times, knowing she was cunning enough to orchestrate an escape. Meanwhile, he dispatched riders bearing messages to Winterfell and also to Robb. The Raven carried details of their victory and a request for additional forces to help secure the northern coast. Some of the surviving Ironborn offered to yield, claiming they had been misled by Balon's promises. Theon forced them to swear oaths of surrender to the king in the north and set them to repairing the damage they had wrought. Slowly, news trickled in that more Ironborn were pulling back to the sea. Balon's planned invasion was faltering, thanks in no small part to Theon's actions and the fierce resistance of the Northmen. House Manderley was said to be dispatching a fleet from White Harbor to chase off the Ironborn longships still prowling the coast. All across the north, local lords rose to defend their land, driving back the reavers. Theon could practically taste the resentment that must be brewing in Pike. It was a grim satisfaction. If his father had not betrayed Robb's trust, Theon might have found a place for the Ironborn in the new order. But now that chance was all but lost. Weeks later, a rider from Robb reached Deepwood Mott bearing a personal message. Robb praised Theon's actions and urged him to hold fast. He was sending the Great John north with a larger force to ensure the Ironborn could not attempt another landing. The letter ended with a request. Robb needed Theon's counsel soon, for the war in the south still raged and alliances were shifting rapidly. Theon took it as a command to return to the main host once the threat in the north was secured. By then, he hoped the Ironborn would be scattered enough that local forces could handle any lingering raiders. When the Grey John arrived, boisterous and unstoppable, Theon formally handed Asha Greyjoy over as a prisoner of the king in the north. The Grey John guffawed at the sight of a Greyjoy handing over another Greyjoy. "That's a tale for the singers," he declared, slapping Theon on the back so hard it nearly knocked the air from his lungs. "You're a wolf at heart, lad." Theon forced a half-smile, though his chest tightened at the phrase. Once he might have gloated. Now he felt too weary from the conflict. Still, he appreciated the sentiment. The North had, at last, come to accept him. But it had cost blood, his own and that of his birth-kin. There was no turning back now. He left Deepwood Mott with a small retinue, heading south to rejoin Robb. Along the way, he saw the ravages that war had inflicted on the north. Burned farmsteads, families huddled in the cold, the first hush of an early snowfall drifting from leaden skies. Winter was coming indeed, and the land was weary from strife. Every step Theon took reminded him that the realm was tearing itself apart in these countless small tragedies, each overshadowed by the big battles men sang about. At Moat Cailin, Theon found that the fortress still stood in northern hands. Though battered, it held enough men to ward off any new incursion. Theon passed through the ancient causeway, marveling at the bogs and marshes stretching out on all sides. A small group of traveling merchants recognized him as he rode by, and they hailed him timidly, as if unsure what to make of a Greyjoy wearing northern colors. He arrived in the Riverlands to discover Robb's host encamped near the twins. Theon's stomach sank at the name. House Frey's reputation preceded it, and he had heard the stories of Walder Frey's cunning. He was greeted by Roose Bolton's men, who told him that Robb was inside the twins, negotiating with Lord Walder for safe passage and a potential alliance. Tension hovered in the air. Theon felt uneasy. He'd heard enough about Walder Frey's unpredictability. Entering the fortress, Theon was struck by the number of Freys swarming about, each wearing the twin tower sigil, each with that watchful, suspicious air. He was ushered to where Robb awaited in a small solar. The relief on Robb's face upon seeing Theon was plain. They clasped arms, the presence of Catelyn Stark and several Freys reminding them to keep their composure. But Theon could sense the wave of gratitude emanating from Robb. Catelyn explained the situation in hushed tones. They needed Frey support to cross the Trident, or else they would be stalled, potentially surrounded. Walder Frey had demanded certain promises in return: marriages, titles, alliances. The tension was thick, for they all knew Walder Frey's pride and temper were legendary. "Theon," Robb said later, in a private moment snatched in a side chamber, "I can't thank you enough for securing the North against your father. I trusted you, and you've proven that trust was not misplaced." Theon bowed his head. "I only did what needed doing. Balon's betrayal was an insult to your generosity. He deserves whatever comes of it." Robb nodded, a flash of sympathy in his eyes. "It must have been difficult, facing your sister in battle." Theon shrugged off the question, though inside he felt the old pang of sorrow. "We're past all that now. My place is here with you. We have a war to finish." Robb's expression flickered with the heavy weight of his responsibilities. "Yes, we do." Over the next days, Theon witnessed the delicate dance between Robb and Walder Frey. Promises were made. Edmure Tully's upcoming marriage to Rosalind Frey was arranged. Catelyn Stark's expression was tense. Theon suspected she disliked dealing with Walder Frey as much as Robb did. But the war demanded alliances. Theon, though not a diplomat, watched from the sidelines, careful not to antagonize the old lord. Frey men eyed him warily, for tales of a Greyjoy fighting for the Starks must have circulated. At last, the negotiations concluded and Walder Frey granted them passage. Theon felt a rush of relief, even if he sensed a certain cunning glint in the old man's eye. The North would not be trapped. They could press on. Theon worried about the cost of these alliances. He had seen how easily vows could be broken in wartime. Balon's betrayal was proof of that. But for now, the king in the North had little choice. They marched out from the Twins across the green fields. Thunderclouds gathered overhead and a chill wind set cloaks flapping. Theon rode near the head of the column, the direwolf banner snapping in the breeze. Men around him spoke of how the war might turn next. Would they face Tywin's host in the Westerlands again, or march on King's Landing if Stannis faltered? Theon kept his opinions guarded, though a small voice in him wondered how many more would die before the realm found peace. Days turned into weeks once more, and the northern host approached the outskirts of the Westerlands. Theon heard rumors that the Lannisters were massing near the Blackwater, having turned aside Stannis' assault with wildfire and cunning. The Tyrells had shown up at the last moment, ensuring Joffrey's victory in King's Landing. Now, the Lannisters' hold on the Iron Throne was stronger than ever. The North would not find an easy path to dethroning them. But they held Jaime Lannister as prisoner, and that might yet serve as leverage. Theon prepared himself for another stretch of harsh campaigning. He worked on training new recruits, drilling them in archery, showing them how to best handle a spear charge. While Robb conferred with his lords, Theon saw to the men, forging bonds of trust. Many recognized how he'd fought off the Ironborn invasion in the North. Some saluted him with genuine respect. Theon could hardly believe how far he had come. In a realm full of shifting loyalties, he had made a stand and the North had accepted him. Yet as the camp prepared for another push into enemy territory, Theon felt a faint unease stirring in his chest. War had a way of punishing even the purest intentions. He thought of how close Asha had come to seizing Winterfell, of how Walder Frey had demanded lavish promises in exchange for a crossing, of how the Lannisters had time and again slipped away, gathering new allies. He thought of Sansa and Arya Stark, rumored to be captives still, though no one truly knew Arya's fate for certain. He wondered if, in the end, all their hopes would splinter like driftwood upon the jagged rocks of ambition and betrayal. But then he would see Robb amid the men, offering a word of gratitude, his direwolf Grey Wind loping by his side, an image of northern determination. Theon would recall the vow he made in that courtyard in Winterfell years ago, the vow forged not by words but by the bond of growing up together, by the countless hours training side by side. That vow bound him tighter than any piece of paper or ephemeral promise from Balon Greyjoy. As he checked the fletching on his arrows one windy afternoon, Theon considered his choices. He might never set foot on Pike again without scorn or hostility. If Robb prevailed, Theon would be the man who turned his sword against the Iron Islands, who refused to join Balon Greyjoy's quest for a new kingdom. He would be branded a kinslayer by his own people. Yet if Robb lost, the Lannisters would eventually come for them all, and the Ironborn might carve out a piece of the North, turning it into a land of fear and cruelty. He decided, with a quiet resolve, that he would see this through no matter what. Theon Greyjoy had chosen the North, chosen Robb Stark, chosen a sense of brotherhood over the savage demands of reaving. That was his path, for good or ill. He closed his eyes, recalling the swirl of the sea around Pike's rocky base, the smell of salt and rotting kelp. He let that memory recede, replaced by an image of Winterfell's godwood, the heart tree's crimson leaves stirring in a gentle breeze, sunlight dancing on the quiet pool. He pictured the children of Ned Stark, the way Bran used to climb the walls, the way Rickon would trail after them, the laughter of Sansa, the wild spirit of Arya, the steadfast presence of Robb. He was a Greyjoy, but he was also Theon of Winterfell in every way that mattered. And so he would remain. Late that evening, as the northern host broke camp and began the march deeper into the Westerlands, Theon rode alongside Robb at the head of the column. Wolves howled in the distance, their chorus echoing across the rolling hills. The breeze smelled of pine and distant hearth fires. The men, grim-faced, trudged forward, battered by the hardships of a long campaign, but united under the dire wolf banner. Theon glanced at Robb. The king in the north rode with quiet confidence, eyes scanning the darkening horizon. He sensed Theon's gaze and offered a small nod, nothing grand or theatrical, just a brief, warm acknowledgement that said, without words, we stand together. They pressed on into the gathering night, an army led by a young king determined to win freedom for his people, and at his side, a one-time hostage who had found his true home in the cause he served. Though the future was uncertain and shadows lingered over them all, Theon Greyjoy rode on, heart steady, secure in the knowledge that he had finally chosen where he belonged, and that choice would guide him until the end. Theon Greyjoy rode at Robb Stark's side through the gathering dusk, the heavy tread of the northern host echoing across the broken hills of the Westerlands. Each hoofbeat felt like a heartbeat in some great creature of war, a living, breathing mass of steel-clad soldiers, armed camp followers, supply wagons dragged by oxen, and outriders scanning the horizon. Theon's throat felt dry despite the chill wind sweeping down from distant mountains, and he tried to put his thoughts in order. The tension in the air was palpable. They had come so far, fought so many battles, yet the final outcome of the war was no clearer than the day Ned Stark's head fell from the block. Robb cast Theon a somber glance, and Theon nodded back. In that small exchange, Theon felt a sense of belonging that had grown only stronger in the wake of Balon's betrayal and the fighting in the north. That fight had cost the Ironborn dearly. Their invasion had been repulsed, Deepwood Mott had been reclaimed, Asha Greyjoy, Theon's own sister, sat in chains somewhere behind the lines. Winterfell still stood under the protection of those too young or old to march south, but the boy Lord Bran had not been threatened by the Ironborn after all. For that much Theon was grateful. Now, as Robb's army advanced, they faced a new array of challenges. Word came that Tywin Lannister's attentions had shifted back west after defeating Stannis Baratheon on the Blackwater with the help of the Tyrells. Though the Lannisters had not entirely crushed Stannis, they had delayed him enough to secure King's Landing. Rumor said Tywin was free to bring renewed pressure to the Riverlands and, by extension, the north. Robb had to keep moving, keep striking or threatening, forcing Tywin to divide his power instead of uniting it. There was constant speculation in the camp about the Vale. Would Lady Lisa Tully ever intervene? About Dorne, would the Martells remain aloof, still nursing their old hatred of the Lannisters, or would they one day declare for one side? Only the gods knew. Theon spent much of his time among the archers and the cavalry, ensuring discipline, passing on what he knew of raiding tactics, and quietly reinforcing that his loyalty lay with the king in the north. Most of the soldiers accepted him now. He had proven himself by driving out his own blood when they tried to invade. Of course, a few men still glowered behind his back, recalling that the Greyjoy rebellion had once cost the north dearly. But distrust had largely given way to recognition that Theon Greyjoy was a valuable asset, fiercely determined to fight for Robb. They pushed deeper into Lannister territory, encountering villages burnt or emptied, fields stripped of grain, and an uneasy hush that seemed to pervade the land. A few unlucky peasants remained, cowering in huts or scavenging for scraps. When northern outriders captured a small group of Lannister scouts, Robb questioned them himself, in that quiet, controlled tone that belied his anger. Tywin was gathering forces in the southern reaches of the Westerlands, near the Gold Road, preparing to strike back. If Robb remained too long in these parts, Tywin could corner him. If he left, the Lannisters would reoccupy them, and the war would drag on. The question haunted them: where to find a decisive blow that would force the Iron Throne to negotiate. They still held Jaime Lannister hostage. Catelyn Stark personally watched over him now, as he had proven too valuable a prize to lose. Every day, lords and knights came and went to Robb's war councils, each with some new piece of rumor or suggestion. Theon often found himself standing along the edge of these councils, keen-eyed, offering what tidbits he could when asked. He tried to read the expressions of the key northern lords. Roose Bolton, expressionless as ever. The Great John, loud and eager to risk bold maneuvers. Rickard Karstark, still nursing a deep hatred for Jaime Lannister, though compelled to remain loyal to Robb. One gray morning, Theon was summoned to a smaller gathering. Robb and Catelyn, along with Roose Bolton, the Great John, Ser Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, and a few other trusted advisors. The dim light filtered through the tense canvas walls, illuminating a table strewn with rough maps. Robb leaned on his forearms, studying them. He looked up when Theon arrived, gesturing for him to join them. "Theon," Robb said, "we've had word that Tywin Lannister is mustering a fresh host not far from Lannisport. He's pulled men back from the Golden Tooth, and it looks like he wants to confront us before we can withdraw. We might still slip away northward, but that would mean abandoning what we've gained." Theon glanced at the maps. He recognized the shape of the coastline, the location of Lannisport, the cluster of smaller ports to the north. If they stayed, they risked entrapment. If they left, all this effort would amount to little more than raids. He spoke softly, mindful that the lords around him might still bristle at his counsel. If Tywin is gathering near Lannisport, it means he wants to protect the seat of his power. Casterly Rock is close by. Perhaps we could threaten a direct assault on the rock, force him to split his forces. "That's madness," rumbled the Great John, though he didn't sound entirely dismissive. "Even if we took the rock, the Lannisters might burn us out eventually. It's too strongly fortified." Catelyn Stark smoothed her hands over the map's edges. "Yet if we truly want the Lannisters to bend, we need a threat so dire they'll consider ransoming peace. A direct attack on the rock or Lannisport might serve." She paused, glancing at Robb. "But our numbers are not what they once were." Roose Bolton's voice emerged like a whisper of cold wind. "We would need cunning, something more than a simple siege. Perhaps infiltration or sabotage. But that would require time, and we do not have it." Robb exhaled, frustration etched into his face. "I can't squander men on a fruitless siege that might drag on for months. The realm is fracturing, Stannis is licking his wounds, the Tyrells have tied themselves to Joffrey, and we have no word from the Vale or Dorne. Meanwhile, the north is still vulnerable to Ironborn raids. If I can force Tywin to the table by capturing something he values, Jaime's life might tip the balance, but that alone hasn't yet." There was a weighty silence. Theon cast a glance at Brynden Tully, who was known for his sharper insight. The Blackfish finally spoke, his voice gruff but measured. "We might not need to hold Casterly Rock for long. A show of force could suffice, a real threat to the seat of Lannister power. If we slip a small force close, block the roads, and harry them, Tywin might be forced to peel off a large part of his army for the defense. That alone could give us a chance to maneuver or to threaten something else, like seizing more of the coast." Robb steepled his fingers. "It's risky. But all war is risk. Let me consider it." He dismissed them after more quiet deliberation, indicating that he'd make a decision soon. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of distant rain. Theon walked through the lines of tents, nodding to men who offered half-salutes. He felt the pulse of the army, a subdued tension that always grew before major maneuvers. Sentries sharpened swords, pack horses snorted, and the cooks struggled to stretch provisions. A certain weariness hung in the air, too. As the day wore on, Theon found himself lingering near the picket lines, gazing at the rolling land that stretched west. He thought of the time he had spent driving out the Ironborn from the north, the memory of crossing swords with his sister still raw in his mind. Now she was a captive in Robb's camp, though not kept with the common prisoners. Catelyn had insisted Asha be treated according to her rank, but guarded night and day. Theon sometimes wondered if he should speak to her, try to glean whether Balon Greyjoy would relent. But the mere thought of that conversation made his stomach clench with a tumult of guilt, anger, and regret. At dusk, after the war councils ended, Theon decided to seek her out. He told himself it was necessary for the war effort. Maybe Asha could provide insight into the Ironborn's future moves. Deep down, another part of him wanted a final confrontation, some kind of closure to the swirling emotions he could not fully name. A few Stark guardsmen stood outside the small pavilion that served as Asha's cell. They recognized Theon and allowed him to pass, though one offered a warning glance. Inside, by the flickering light of a single lantern, Asha Greyjoy sat on a narrow cot. She looked up when Theon stepped in, her features shadowed. He paused, remembering how formidable she had been on Pike, so confident in her identity and the old way. She seemed smaller now, the chain at her ankle forcing her into limited movement, her hair disheveled. Yet the defiance in her eyes remained. "You," she said curtly. "Come to gloat, little brother?" "No," he replied, fighting to keep his voice level. "But we should speak." She let out a short, scornful laugh. "About what?" "How you've taken the wolf's side against your own blood. How you run errands for Robb Stark, wagging your tail like a loyal hound." Theon felt his anger rise, but he kept it in check. "I remember how father spat on the alliance I offered, how he turned on Robb the moment it suited him. That was not my choice." "Was it not?" she shot back, eyes gleaming. "Father has always believed that the Iron Islands must seize what they can. You knew that when you left for the north. Instead of bending him to your cause, you tried to bend him to some dream of courtesy and treaties. You failed, and now you kill Ironborn for the wolves. You destroyed any courtesy when you marched on Winterfell," Theon retorted, voice rising despite himself. "When you burned northern villages, took captives, put children to the sword. Do you expect me to weep for men who came to slaughter innocents?" Asha's lips curled in a half-snarl, half-smile. "You speak like a Greenlander now. The old way was never about innocence. It's about strength, and the north was ripe for plunder after Robb marched south. You can't see it because you've lived too long in Winterfell's shadow." Theon clenched his fists, forcing himself not to lash out. "I see well enough. I see that Balon Greyjoy has thrown away any chance the Iron Islands had to gain fair terms. The realm is in chaos, but eventually someone will win. If it isn't Robb, it'll be the Lannisters or another. And they'll come for Pike, just as Robert Baratheon once did. Another rebellion quashed, more Ironborn left to rot." Her sneer faltered, just for an instant. "There's always the next raid, the next reaving. That's what we are, Theon." He studied her, a painful knot tightening in his chest. "It's not what I am anymore." She fell silent. For a moment, the only sound was the faint rustle of canvas and the drip of a half-clogged water bucket. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You might stay a prisoner until the end of this war, or be handed over to the Lannisters if we lose. Or maybe you'll face King Robb's justice. But there's another way. Write to Balon. Urge him to stop his raids in the north. End this pointless war for the Iron Islands. If there's any piece of you that cares about our people more than you hate me, do it." Asha snorted, then turned her head away. "I can't speak for father. He'll do what he wants. Balon Greyjoy bows to no one. He'd rather see the islands burn." Theon felt a crushing sense of defeat. Despite everything, a piece of him had hoped that Asha might see reason. But her loyalty to Pike and the old way ran deep. "I'm sorry," Theon said quietly, and he meant it. He hated the rift that had formed between them, the knowledge that one day they might stand on a battlefield again, swords drawn, if Balon refused to relent. If father keeps this up, he'll doom the Iron Islands. The north won't suffer that kind of betrayal forever. She didn't answer, staring at the lantern's flicker, her expression set in unyielding lines. With a heavy heart, Theon turned and left. Outside, the night's chill wrapped around him. He heard the distant clank of armor, the shuffle of sentries. Overhead, a waxing moon struggled to pierce the heavy clouds. Theon closed his eyes for a moment, letting the bleakness of his sister's words sink in. Then he squared his shoulders and walked away from her pavilion. Tomorrow would bring new trials, and there was no time to wallow in regrets. When Robb's plans crystallized, Theon recognized at once the ambition in them. The king in the north intended a bold approach near the southern edges of the Westerlands. They would threaten a feint at Casterly Rock, drawing Tywin's attention, while a second portion of the army aimed to disrupt the Lannisters' supply lines. If done correctly, they might undermine Tywin's ability to respond quickly, forcing him to either abandon Lannisport or risk exposing the rock. Robb had no illusions of taking Casterly Rock by storm. It was one of the most heavily fortified castles in Westeros, but he intended to rattle the Lannisters enough to force negotiations. Throughout the next several days, Theon and other commanders drilled the men in formation. They marched under the watchful gaze of outriders who reported any sign of Lannister cavalry. Skirmishes flared here and there. One day, Theon led a small mounted force that ambushed a group of Lannister foragers near a shallow stream. The fighting was brief but vicious, leaving the water stained pink with blood. Theon felt that same cold determination as always, burying any pity for the men who collapsed under his sword. War had taught him to kill swiftly or be killed. The deeper they pressed, the more resistance they encountered. Tywin's outriders tested them with arrows, forcing Robb's vanguard to halt and form defensive lines. Theon found himself dismounting at times to take cover behind rocky outcrops, trading arrow fire with the hidden Lannisters. But Robb's men were hardened by months of war. They advanced methodically, never losing discipline. In that manner, they drew closer to the craggy hills that shielded Lannisport from the northern approach. High ridges towered above them, giving any defenders a crucial vantage. Robb ordered scouts to find passable routes through the hills. Rumor said these paths were narrow and treacherous, easily blocked by a small force. It was a potential killing ground if Tywin guessed their plan. One evening, Theon was summoned again to Robb's command tent. Rain dripped off the canopy in a steady patter, turning the ground muddy. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The Greyjoy was complaining about the difficulty of crossing the ridges. Roose Bolton stood silent, watchful as always. Brynden Tully leaned over the map, frowning. Robb paced. "We've word from our outriders. Tywin's men hold the largest pass. They've built barricades, posted archers along the heights. Any direct assault would be costly," Robb said. He looked to Theon. "I need a diversion. Something that will draw their attention away from the pass, or at least split their forces. You've led raids before, what would you suggest?" Theon studied the map, recalling how Ironborn might tackle such terrain. "If there's a lesser-known path or a game trail, we could send a small band over it to strike their rear. Light some fires, raise havoc, make it look like a larger force is attacking from behind. If they panic and pull men off the main pass, your army might force a crossing." "It's dangerous," Roose Bolton observed. "We could lose that small band entirely if they're discovered. But it might work," Brynden Tully added, tapping the map. "There's talk of an old shepherd's trail to the east. Narrow as a goat track, but passable if we bring a lightly armored force." Robb nodded, his gaze piercing Theon's. "Would you lead it?" Theon swallowed. "If you wish. I'll take volunteers. We'll move at night, keep quiet." "Choose your men," Robb instructed. "We'll coordinate the timing. When I give the signal, you strike. Our main host will assault the pass, but hopefully many of the defenders will already have been drawn off." Theon bowed his head. That night, as the army made camp near a sheltered copse, Theon approached men he trusted, some archers from the north, a few light cavalry who had proven adept at stealth, along with a handful of skirmishers. He explained the plan: cross the ridge under cover of darkness, circle around to the Lannister rear, then create as much chaos as possible. It was a mission from which they might never return. Despite the danger, enough men volunteered. They were as determined as Theon to see Robb succeed. A scout who'd traveled this region once before swore he knew a path that could bypass the Lannister fortifications. They readied themselves quietly. No heavy armor, only boiled leather or mail shirts, short bows, swords. They carried minimal supplies. In the early hours under a starless sky, Theon led them away from the main camp, heading east. The darkness was almost complete, the only light coming from the faint glow of the occasional lightning flash far off on the horizon. Their horses picked their way over rough ground. To lighten the load, some men walked, leading their mounts. Theon's heart thudded at every rock slide or sudden shift in the wind. If the Lannisters discovered them now, there would be no escape. They found the narrow track, a steep, twisting route over the hillside. The footing was treacherous, the ground slick from earlier rain, the drop a dizzying plunge if they slipped. The men moved in single file. Every so often, a horse would skitter, sending pebbles rattling down the slope, and Theon would tense, expecting a shout of alarm from above. But it never came. At last, just before dawn, they crested the ridge. Below them lay a valley that sloped gently down toward the main Lannister encampment near the pass. They could see watchfires burning in neat rows, the flicker of torches among sentries. Theon guessed that the bulk of Tywin's forces remained near the pass itself, but there were clearly wagons and tents scattered throughout the valley. If they hit them fast, it might look like a full-scale attack. Theon waited until the eastern sky showed the barest hint of gray. Then he signaled his men. They mounted quietly, drew weapons. In a rush of pounding hooves, they descended on the camp's flank. Shouts erupted from bleary-eyed Lannister sentries. Theon spurred his horse toward a wagon that looked like it contained barrels of pitch. One of his archers shot a flaming arrow into it. It went up in a whoosh of fire and acrid smoke. Men scrambled in panic, uncertain of the attackers' numbers. Steel rang against steel. Theon slashed at a guard who darted in front of him, toppling the man with a vicious slice to the side. Then he veered to the left, urging his horse onward. More men followed, setting tents aflame. The flickering light revealed the confusion of the Lannisters, who seemed convinced they were facing an entire vanguard. Horn calls blared. "Fall back! Fall back into formation!" Theon heard a Lannister officer shouting. But it was chaos. Some men ran for the pass, others tried to rally around a standard. Horses screamed, rearing away from the flames. Theon signaled his archers to dismount and unleash more arrows into the milling ranks of soldiers. They obeyed, knocking arrow after arrow. Theon prayed that Robb and the main host would see the glow of the fires and realize the raid was underway. If all went according to plan, the Lannister commander would redirect men from the pass to deal with this threat. They could not linger too long. If a large Lannister force materialized from the pass, Theon's small band would be crushed. Already, some knights were forming a line, shields gleaming in the light of the spreading fires. Theon shouted for his men to pull back in intervals, launching arrows as they went, giving the illusion of a more numerous force. One of the northern skirmishers took a lance to the chest in the retreat, toppling from his saddle. Theon gritted his teeth, swallowing a surge of fury and sorrow. At last, they broke away from the camp, leaving it in chaos behind them. They circled wide, searching for a safe vantage from which they could gauge the Lannisters' response. Dawn had fully broken now, bathing the ridges in weak light. Smoke coiled into the sky. Theon's heart pounded, adrenaline making his limbs tremble. He counted heads. They had lost 3 men so far, with several wounded. But if their raid had accomplished its purpose, it might be worth it. Climbing to an outcrop of rock, Theon squinted down into the valley. He saw movement. A significant portion of the Lannister troops were now streaming away from the pass, hurrying to contain the threat. So far, it looked like they believed Theon's group was bigger than it was. Maybe half their foot had turned back. He allowed himself a fierce grin. This was the signal Robb needed. He had no doubt that the king in the north would time his assault to exploit this confusion. Theon turned to the men around him. "We've done our part. Let's vanish before they regroup." They rode hard along the flank of the hills, taking a twisting path that hopefully would lead them around any Lannister outriders. Now and then they glimpsed enemy scouts in the distance, but the dust and smoke of the valley below concealed their smaller band's movements. They pressed on until they found a ravine that offered shelter. Only hours later, after resting and tending their wounded, did they receive word that the pass had fallen to Robb. A northern outrider came galloping up, face flushed. He was a young lad with a Karstark sigil on his torn cloak, and he saluted Theon. "My lord, King Robb has taken the pass with minimal losses. Your diversion drew off more than a quarter of the defenders. The Lannisters scattered. The king bids you rejoin him at once." Cheers rose from Theon's men. A surge of relief washed over him. They had succeeded. Theon could almost see Robb's triumphant grin, hear the Greyjoy's booming laughter as they crossed the pass the Lannisters had tried so hard to hold. They had turned the enemy's advantage into a stepping stone. Theon led his battered group back. The route was winding, but eventually they met with Robb's main host near a bend in the road, now firmly on the far side of the ridges. Smoke still smudged the sky to the east from the fires set in the Lannister camp. Robb rode forward to greet them personally, Grey Wind loping at his side. "Well done," Robb said, his tone warm with gratitude. "That was the wedge we needed." Theon dismounted, exhaustion settling into his bones. He offered a slight bow. "We lost a few good men." "They'll be honored," Robb replied, then gestured for Theon to walk with him. As they moved along the column, men clapped Theon on the shoulder or called out thanks. Some even cheered. Theon felt a strange mix of pride and sorrow. He had never been so well regarded by so many. He had found the acceptance here that Pike had always withheld. It was exhilarating and painful in equal measure. They camped that night near a shallow lake, the hills rising around them like black silhouettes under a star-strewn sky. Theon learned that the Lannister force had pulled back westward in disarray. Some had retreated toward Lannisport, others had regrouped under a banner of twin lions and marched off to find Tywin's main army. The north had a window to advance further. Over the next few days, they pressed on. Each dawn found them deeper in Lannister territory, the land richer, dotted with vineyards and rolling pastures. The difference from the war-torn Riverlands was stark. Until now, the Westerlands had been spared the brunt of fighting. Theon wondered what the local lords thought as they saw the dire wolf banners approaching. Some might hide in their keeps, while others risked parley, hoping to avoid destruction. Robb took care not to let the army devolve into plunderers. He issued strict orders against looting and harming the small folk. The men grumbled, for provisions were scarce, but Theon admired Robb's sense of honor and discipline. They would not become as hated as the Lannisters. This was a campaign for the North's freedom, not a pillaging spree. Theon saw the wisdom in it. Hearts and minds, even in enemy territory, could shape the tides of war. Still, tension grew among the northern lords. Many wanted to push all the way. To the gates of Lannisport, perhaps even to the outskirts of Casterly Rock. The Great John declared that if they burned the Lannister fleet in the harbor, they could cripple Tywin's trade and supply. Others counseled caution. Tywin might be massing an army large enough to crush them once and for all. As they neared a broad crossroads, a raven arrived bearing news. Edmure Tully had faced another Lannister incursion near Riverrun. The letter suggested that Tywin's main strength was not as large as feared. He had dispatched roving bands to test the Riverlands, but remained uncertain how best to respond to Robb's threat in the west. This was the opportunity Robb had hoped for. That night, in a large war council by lantern light, Robb announced that they would indeed move on Lannisport. The plan was not to mount a suicidal siege but to capture or burn the Lannister fleet anchored there, along with supplies and wealth that flowed through the port. If they succeeded, the blow to House Lannister's power would be enormous. Tywin might be forced to treat for peace. Excitement rippled through the camp. The Great John cheered, hoisting his ale flask. Others, like Roose Bolton, nodded quietly, though Theon caught a glimmer in Bolton's pale eyes that unsettled him. There was something about that man, so calm, so controlled, that made Theon think of a predator waiting for the right moment. Still, Bolton remained outwardly loyal, and Theon had no reason to question his obedience. While the main host prepared for the final push, Theon and a few selected captains scouted ahead to find the best approach to Lannisport. He learned that the city nestled along a natural bay, with high cliffs to the north. The port was well fortified with walls and towers. Taking it would require either a cunning infiltration or a massive frontal assault. But Theon recalled his experiences with the Ironborn. Ports were vulnerable from the seaward side, if they had ships. They did not. Yet that was not the only way. Another approach was to slip men into the city via the hills to the south, near a smaller harbor used by fishermen. At dusk one day, Theon returned from a scouting ride, exhausted and dusty, to find Robb waiting in the command pavilion with an anxious look. "Theon," Robb began, "Lord Bolton suggests that we can lure out the city garrison if we arrange a ruse, perhaps a smaller portion of our force feigning weakness on the main road, while another group sneaks around to the harbor. When the garrison sallies forth to meet the threat, the infiltration group can strike from inside, open the gates, or set fire to the ships." Theon frowned, recalling the earlier success at the pass. It might work, but the garrison commander would have to take the bait. That means showing them something they truly believe is an easy target. "Bolton proposed using some of the more expendable units," Robb said, lowering his voice. "I don't like the word expendable, but I see the logic. A small diversion might sustain heavy losses. He's volunteered to lead it himself." That caught Theon's attention. Bolton risking himself in such a manner? Odd. He's cunning. He'll do it if he thinks it brings him glory or advantage. Robb's jaw tightened. "I know, but if this plan works, we might secure Lannisport with minimal bloodshed overall. Or at least strike a crippling blow to their fleet." "I'll go where you need me," Theon offered. Robb considered, shaking his head. "No, I want you to lead a detachment through the southern approach. You've proven you can handle stealth and sudden assault. Bolton will handle the feint. The Great John and I will command the main force near the city's eastern gates. When they respond to Bolton, we all strike. If we can break in quickly, we'll prevent the city from preparing a defense." Thus, the plan was set in motion. The northern host advanced carefully, establishing a forward camp near a small river that flowed from the east into the bay. Patrols scoured the countryside, capturing a handful of Lannister outriders. One captive revealed that the city's garrison was led by a cousin of Tywin, a certain Ser Devon Lannister known for his fierce pride and inexperience. If that was true, he might be prone to rash decisions perfect for their ruse. On the eve of the assault, the atmosphere in the camp crackled with tension. Men polished their swords, whispered final prayers to the gods. Theon joined a group of archers to finalize how they would slip in from the south. The fisherfolk's harbor, so the scouts said, was lightly guarded, mainly older men or youths pressed into service. If Theon's detachment could neutralize them swiftly, they could set the Lannister ships ablaze from the docks. Night fell, cool and silent. Theon wandered among the tents, ensuring all was ready. As he passed Bolton's section of the camp, he paused to see a cluster of men bearing the flayed man sigil listening intently to their lord. The flicker of torchlight revealed Bolton's pale face, expressionless as he spoke instructions in a low voice. Theon felt a chill. The man was dangerous. But in war, many dangerous men found their moment to shine. Before heading to his own tent, Theon was surprised when Catelyn Stark approached him. She looked drawn, worry lining her face, yet her eyes were calm. "Theon," she said softly, "I wish to thank you. You stood by Robb when we needed you most. Whatever comes of this, I won't forget your loyalty." He was momentarily taken aback. "Thank you, my lady. I only did what I thought right." She studied him, some sympathy in her expression. "Many men wouldn't have turned on their father's cause. You did, and I know it cost you dearly. We are all caught in this war, forced to choose between dreadful options. But your choice helped protect my children in Winterfell." At that, Theon swallowed, nodding. "I did what needed to be done. Robb's always been like a brother to me." Catelyn touched his arm gently. "I pray we all see the day this war ends, and we can look back on these choices without regret." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Theon alone with that faint hope. Dawn was just a faint glow when the assault began. Theon's detachment of roughly 100 men slipped southward under cover of darkness, circling wide around the city's stone walls. They carried torches wrapped in oil-soaked rags, short bows for quick close-range combat, grappling hooks if needed. Theon felt an odd calm settle over him. He'd led men on secret raids before. This was simply another. Yet the stakes were monumental. They reached the Fisher Harbor as the first traces of pale light streaked the sky. Boats bobbed in the calm waters, and Theon could see the outlines of larger ships further up the coastline. Merchant galleys, warships bearing the Golden Lion standard. Lannisport's main harbor was a short distance to the north, behind heavier fortifications, but these anchored vessels might serve as a significant chunk of the local fleet. If they torched them, it would deliver a staggering blow. 2 sentries stood half asleep near the small wooden pier. Theon signaled his men to fan out. Quiet as ghosts, a pair of northern skirmishers crept up and dispatched the sentries with swift knives to the throat. A quick stifled cry, then silence. The rest of the fishermen's huts remained dark. Theon moved forward, waving his torches. The men began to scatter along the docks, igniting pitch-laden arrows. They launched them into the moored vessels, some of which were laden with crates and barrels that might be flammable. Within moments, an eerie orange glow flickered across the water as the first flames caught. Sailcloth snapped and crackled as sparks leapt from deck to deck. Smoke billowed. A startled shout rose from one of the huts, a young Lannister guard stumbling out wide-eyed. Theon's archers cut him down with a hail of arrows. Then the rest of Theon's men charged through the ramshackle cluster of supply sheds, seizing or killing anyone they found. A handful of fishermen fled in terror, diving into the shallow water and swimming for their lives. Across the harbor, Theon spotted a group of Lannister soldiers rushing to respond, steel glinting in the firelight. He signaled half his men to form a line. They met the defenders in a clash of swords. Theon fought fiercely, parrying a spear thrust and driving his blade into a man's gut. Another soldier swung at his head, but Theon ducked, then slammed his pommel into the man's face. He heard bone crunch. The air thickened with smoke. The reek of burning pitch stung Theon's nose. Flames danced across the decks of the moored ships, and Theon heard frantic cries from men trapped aboard. Even if they tried to cast off, they were already engulfed. Theon felt no triumph in the carnage, only a grim satisfaction that they had dealt a savage blow to the Lannisters. A horn call in the distance told him the city was now aware of the attack. That was good. Roose Bolton's diversion and Robb's main force would be closing in from the east. The garrison would be in chaos, uncertain whether the real threat was inside or outside the walls. Theon shouted for his men to hold their ground to keep the fire spreading. Then, from behind a tall storage warehouse, a group of Lannister knights appeared, charging on horseback. They had somehow maneuvered through the narrow streets. Theon cursed. They could do serious damage to his lightly armored force. He yelled for the archers to form ranks. They loosed a volley that unhorsed 2 knights and caused the others to veer. But the knights kept coming, lances lowered. Theon braced. He flung himself aside at the last moment, hearing a thunderous crash as the knights smashed into the front line. Screams erupted. Theon rolled across the muddy ground, coming up with his sword at the ready. One knight reined in, turning to face him. They locked eyes through the slit of the knight's helm. The knight lunged, steel glinting. Theon sidestepped, parried, felt the impact jolt his arm. He gritted his teeth and thrust upward, catching the knight's arm under the plate. Blood spurted and the knight toppled from the saddle. Another volley of arrows hissed in, finishing off the horses. A wave of Theon's men surged forward, hauling the knights from the ground, stabbing with spears. The knights fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and soon lay dead or dying in the swirling smoke. Panting, Theon surveyed the scene. The harbor was fully ablaze, the water reflecting lurid flames. At least half a dozen ships burned, some drifting aimlessly, trailing black smoke into the sky. Ash rained down. The approach from the city side was blocked by wreckage, corpses, and thick smoke. Theon realized that if the Lannister garrison came in full force, his men might be trapped. "Pull back to the southern road," he shouted. "We've done enough." His men obeyed, gathering quickly. They retreated along the shoreline, stepping over fallen Lannisters and bodies half submerged in the shallows. A few small skiffs were floating adrift, their lines severed by the chaos. The fishermen's huts had begun to catch flame as well. Theon allowed himself one last look at the inferno. The Lannisters would not easily replace these ships. The king in the north had drawn first blood here on the enemy's own doorstep. They picked their way around the southern edge of the city, hoping to join up with Robb's main force if they could break through the gates. Shouts, horns, and the clang of steel echoed from the eastern walls, indicating that the battle there had begun in earnest. Theon led his men through winding back roads, occasionally ambushing small pockets of Lannisters who tried to bar their way. The fires behind them spread, throwing the city into panic. Townsfolk cowered or fled into the countryside. Some screamed for help, only to be ignored in the tumult. At last, Theon's group crested a small rise overlooking the main eastern gate. He saw that the gate stood open, battered from within. Bodies lay strewn across the road. Blue-gray smoke churned in the sky, and above the ramparts flew the direwolf banner, flapping in a swirling wind. Theon's chest flooded with fierce relief, for Robb had seized the gate. That meant the city's defenders were in disarray or perhaps had retreated to an inner holdfast. Riding closer, Theon glimpsed Robb in the thick of the city streets, gray wind at his side. The great direwolf lunged at a Lannister man-at-arms, teeth bared, savage. Robb fought on foot, sword glimmering red in the firelight, his cloak singed at the edges. Theon and his men joined with a shout, attacking the Lannisters from the rear. The defenders folded swiftly, some throwing down their weapons, others fighting to the last. "Theon!" Robb's voice rang out. He hacked down a Lannister soldier, then turned. Blood streaked his cheek, but his expression was alight with adrenaline. "You did it. Your plan worked," Theon replied, breathless. "The harbor's burning. Their ships are finished." Robb nodded. "Bolton's diversion drew out half their garrison. We stormed the gate, forced them back. The city is ours for now." They pressed on through the winding streets. People shouted from windows, some throwing water on the flames, others cursing the northerners. Theon noticed that many of the small folk simply huddled out of the way, terrified. They wanted no part of the Lannisters or the Starks, they only wanted to survive. War was an abstract game for kings, but for these people it meant destruction. Some Lannister men still held a watchtower near the port center. Robb ordered a group of archers to surround it while a battering ram was brought forward. Theon joined in, urging caution, since many civilians might be trapped in the adjoining buildings. They hammered at the tower's door, and in time it splintered. The defenders tried to mount a final stand on the tower steps, but they were quickly overwhelmed. All across the city, fires burned. The Greyjoy's men patrolled, forcibly disarming any Lannister pockets they found. Robb established a command post in the courtyard of a minor Lannister estate. Guards were posted to protect the local residents from random looters. Under Robb's orders, they began systematically securing the main avenues, trying to prevent further chaos. In the following hours, Theon helped coordinate the watch. He was exhausted, stained with blood and soot, but the king in the north was counting on him. They met occasional resistance. Some Lannister soldiers refused to yield, especially those who had lost friends or kin. But with the city effectively under Stark control, most realized the fight was lost. By dusk, Lannisport was firmly in northern hands. The harbor smoldered, the ships destroyed. Street after street had been cleared. The city's defenders either lay dead or had surrendered to Bolton, the Great John, or other northern lords. White banners of surrender hung limply from windows. After ensuring the city was secure, Robb's top commanders gathered in the courtyard. Theon arrived to find them standing around a large fountain half-choked with ash. Robb leaned wearily against a broken pillar, gray wind at his feet, panting. Catelyn was there, eyes filled with relief mixed with worry, along with Brynden Tully, the Great John, Roose Bolton, Rickard Karstark, and other key figures. "We've done what we came for," Robb said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "The Lannister fleet is no more. The city is ours, though how long we can hold it remains to be seen. Tywin cannot ignore this. If he marches here, we might be forced to retreat, but the damage is done. He won't be able to mount a strong naval campaign for some time. The Greyjoy grinned, though his face was streaked with grime. Let him march. We'll meet him in the streets of Lannisport and feed him his own gold. Roose Bolton's voice was calm, almost pleasant. We must be careful. A city is difficult to defend without proper fortifications, especially when our supplies are limited. Tywin's host is still formidable. Catelyn stepped forward. This victory might finally bring him to the negotiating table. He'll be desperate to spare Casterly Rock, which is near enough that he'd fear we might threaten it next. Perhaps he'll exchange Sansa and Arya for a start. At that, Theon noticed Rickard Karstark's expression darken. Karstark had never forgiven Jaime Lannister for slaying his sons. Jaime was still in captivity. The potential for a prisoner exchange weighed heavily on everyone, especially Catelyn. Robb straightened. We'll fortify our position here. Let the men rest. Tomorrow we'll send out ravens. We'll propose terms. The North becomes an independent kingdom, Sansa and Arya are returned safely, and we'll release Jaime. If Tywin has any sense, he'll negotiate. Tired nods greeted this. Theon felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps at last all this bloodshed might yield some form of peace. Yet a gnawing doubt lingered. Tywin Lannister was not a man easily cowed. He would want vengeance for this blow. Still, if negotiations failed, Theon had no doubt Robb would fight to the bitter end. In the days that followed, the Starks set about consolidating their hold on Lannisport. They posted sentries along the walls, though the city's defenses were geared more toward the harbor than land-based attacks. A sense of uneasy calm spread. Theon oversaw the disposal of the burned hulks in the harbor, ensuring they wouldn't pose a hazard or drift away. Clouds of black smoke continued to cling to the skyline. The stench of burned wood and charred corpses lingered, a testament to the war's savagery. A few local merchants approached Robb to plead for stability. They offered gold in exchange for protection against looters. Robb handled them politely but firmly. He issued orders that no soldier was to harm the city's small folk. Any man caught looting or committing crimes would face severe punishment. Theon watched as these measures took shape, forging a semblance of order amid the ruin. Civilians began to venture out, reopening shops and trying to salvage their livelihoods. Ravens flew to Casterly Rock with Robb's demands. Days passed, each one stretching into an anxious wait. Northern outriders scouted the roads leading west, bracing for Tywin's inevitable response. The men in the city ate sparingly, supplementing with what they could purchase or requisition from local supplies. Some lords muttered that it was unwise to linger, but Robb stood by his decision. If Tywin agreed to talk, it would be here, and the city was too valuable a bargaining chip to abandon prematurely. Meanwhile, Theon tried to rest, though his sleep was plagued by dreams. Sometimes, he dreamt of Pike's endless waves, or Asha's scornful face as he locked her in chains. Other times, he dreamt of Winterfell's quiet halls. On the third day after taking Lannisport, he awoke at dawn in a borrowed chamber above a merchant's shop. Shouts from the street roused him. He threw on his leathers, grabbed his sword, and rushed down. He found the city in an uproar. A large party of riders bearing Lannister banners approached from the west under a white flag of truce. The alarm was that Tywin himself might be here, or some other highborn envoy. Theon hurried to find Robb, who was already donning his armor in the courtyard. "Word is that Lord Tywin's envoy has arrived," Robb said as Grey Wind padded close. "They carry a peace banner. We'll hear them out in the Great Square." The Great Square was an open space near the city's center, once used for markets and festivals. The northern host formed a ring around it, bristling with spears. Robb rode in at the head of his knights, the direwolf sigil snapping into "You wind." By his side were Catelyn, the Greyjoy, Roose Bolton, Rickard Karstark, and Theon, among other captains. On the far side, the Lannister party waited. A standard bearer held aloft the Lion of Lannister, and beneath it sat 3 riders: Kevan Lannister, Tywin's brother, a tall knight in gilded armor whose face Theon didn't recognize, and a golden-haired youth who could only be one of Tywin's grandsons or cousins. Their expressions were grim. Kevan Lannister dismounted and stepped forward, helmet in hand. Robb also dismounted, meeting him in the middle of the square. The tension was palpable. Both sides had archers and men-at-arms ready to intervene at the slightest provocation. Young wolf, Kevin said, voice carrying across the silent crowd. I come on behalf of Lord Tywin, hand of the king to his grace King Joffrey Baratheon, to treat for terms. Robb inclined his head just enough to be civil. Lord Tywin is wise to seek terms after we took your city and burned your fleet. A flicker of anger darkened Kevin's face, but he remained composed. My lord nephew does not bow to intimidation, but he recognizes that continuing this conflict will only bring further destruction. Then he should agree to my demands, Robb answered, unflinching. Release my sisters, acknowledge the North's independence, accept in exchange for Jaime Lannister. In return, I withdraw from Lannisport and offer a cessation of hostilities. Kevin grimaced. My lord nephew cannot agree to the North's secession. The Iron Throne is not a trifling matter. Sparks of anger lit Robb's gray eyes. Then we have nothing more to discuss. My men and I will hold your city, and if Tywin tries to dislodge us, he'll find it a costly venture. Wait, Kevin said, raising a hand. My nephew is willing to discuss your sister's release in exchange for Jaime's, and he is prepared to consider a measure of autonomy for the North, though not outright independence. He also insists that you return this city at once and pay reparations for its destruction. Derisive laughter rose from the northern ranks. Robb's voice turned icy. You come to me in a city my men occupy, which we took by force. You're in no position to demand reparations. Kevin swallowed hard, but continued, we have tens of thousands of men. You cannot hold Lannisport forever. Our outriders report that your supply lines are stretched thin. Lord Tywin is prepared to march soon. Let him, Robb said curtly. Kevin took a breath. I appeal to your sense of duty. King Joffrey holds Sansa Stark in the Red Keep. If you truly wish her safe return, meet us halfway. The war has gone on too long. The realm bleeds. Let us put an end to it. We are prepared to confirm you as Lord Paramount of the North with expanded rights and near-total autonomy. Sansa will be returned to you, and we will renegotiate a marriage alliance if you so desire. Jaime may be exchanged in turn. This is a generous proposal. A hush fell. Theon could see Robb wrestling with his next words. The North had declared him king, not Lord Paramount. Was he prepared to abandon the crown to ensure Sansa's freedom? To end the war that was ravaging his people? Theon saw the conflict in Robb's eyes, the memory of Ned Stark's execution fueling his defiance, but also the yearning to safeguard what remained of his family. Catelyn stepped forward, her voice hushed but urgent. Robb, please. Sansa's safety is paramount. And Arya, she might still be alive. Robb's jaw worked. He looked at Kevin. Arya, what of my sister Arya? Kevin hesitated. We do not know her whereabouts. She vanished from King's Landing before Lord Eddard's execution. Some suspect she's dead, others that she escaped the city. We cannot barter for her if we do not have her. A bleak expression crossed Robb's face. Then your offer is incomplete. My father died a traitor's death for a lie. My mother's father died at the Twins. The North will not kneel again to a southern king lightly. Kevin bowed his head. You have Jaime, we have Sansa. Let us at least make that exchange as a gesture of good faith. Then we can negotiate further about the structure of the North's governance. There's no need for more bloodshed. Robb's eyes flickered to his mother. Catelyn was clearly torn. She wanted Sansa back, but at what cost? The entire Northern cause had rallied around the notion of an independent king in the North. Would they accept anything less? Roose Bolton spoke up in a silky tone, stepping forward with a half-bow. Your Grace, if I may, the realm is far from stable. If you appear too uncompromising, Lord Tywin might attempt a final strike. Think of your people, your family. The great Jon scowled. We bent the knee once for Robert Baratheon. Look where it got us. The Lannisters butchered Ned Stark. You'd have us kneel again to his spawn. Kevin's knuckles whitened on his helm. Insults will get us nowhere. Very well, if you refuse to consider bending the knee, we can discuss an armistice, a pause in fighting, while we finalize terms for your father's bones, your sister's release, and how we might handle Jaime Lannister. Is that acceptable? Robb's face was unreadable. You ask for an armistice, but your nephew might be using that time to bring more men west. Kevin shook his head firmly. We offer our oath, on the honor of House Lannister. No further hostilities, no movements against Lannisport, while we treat. In exchange, you must not advance farther or threaten Casterly Rock. A murmur rose. That would buy time for both sides. Theon could see the advantage. An armistice might allow Robb to resupply to entrench. It would also allow Tywin to muster. But if there was any chance at a peaceful resolution, this might be the first step. Robb glanced at his mother again, then at Theon. Theon met his gaze and dipped his head, unsure how much influence he had in this matter. But he did recall the horrors of war, the near destruction of Winterfell by the Ironborn, and how it would feel to see more northern villages burned if the Lannisters marched north. Finally, Robb turned back to Kevin. We'll grant an armistice under these conditions. Sansa Stark is to be handed over immediately to my appointed envoy. Once she's safely in our camp, we'll release Jaime, but not before. No Lannister forces are to move within a day's ride of Lannisport, nor will we move closer to Casterly Rock. We'll set a time limit, 2 fortnights, during which we'll attempt to reach a permanent peace. After that, if no agreement is reached, we'll resume hostilities. Kevin bowed stiffly. I believe my nephew will find that acceptable. We'll formalize the details in writing. Robb exhaled, stepping back. The tension eased, though no one was entirely comfortable. Theon saw Rickard Karstark seething. He wanted Jaime to pay for his son's deaths. But at least for the moment, an end to the bloodshed seemed possible. Within the hour, Kevin and Robb set their seals to the armistice. Ravens flew west and east, bearing word of a truce. Over the next few days, scouts confirmed that the Lannister army halted its march. Robb likewise kept his men in Lannisport, though he ordered them to fortify the city's approaches, just in case. Theon spent those days observing the city's recovery. With the fighting paused, some merchants dared to open their shops. Fishermen returned to the less damaged portion of the harbor. Many lamented the destruction of the main docks, the wasted ships. Theon remembered well the stench of burning sails. War touched everyone, even those who tried to remain neutral. At last, word arrived that Sansa Stark had been brought to a nearby outpost under a Lannister banner, awaiting Robb's envoy. Theon watched Robb wrestle with the decision of who to send, for it was risky. Eventually, Catelyn volunteered, unwilling to let her daughter out of her sight. Robb reluctantly agreed. A small escort, including Brynden Tully, would guard her. Before she departed, Catelyn approached Theon once again. My heart is torn, leaving Robb here. But I must see Sansa safely returned. I wanted you to know I am grateful for your role in bringing us to this point. Theon inclined his head. I hope it all works out, my lady. If the armistice collapses. She touched his shoulder lightly. Then we fight again. But for now, let us hope we can spare more lives. She rode out with her party into the golden afternoon sun. The gates of Lannisport opened for her, and Theon watched from a parapet as they disappeared into the distance. An uneasy hush lingered over the city. Some of the northern soldiers looked restless, itching for a new battle. Others clung to the hope that the war might end, that they could return home before winter snows. Late in the day, Theon was summoned to Robb's quarters. Robb had taken over a small fortress-like estate belonging to a lesser Lannister cousin who'd fled. Inside, the rooms were stately but subdued, with tapestries depicting lions chasing deer across sunny fields. Theon found Robb standing by a window, gazing at the courtyard below where men practiced drills. Grey Wind lay stretched out near the fireplace, ears perked when Theon entered. Robb turned, fatigue showing in the set of his jaw. I wanted to talk. Of course, Theon said, crossing the room. Robb leaned against the windowsill. I keep thinking about Father, about how we ended up here. If you'd told me a year ago that I would be king in the north, standing in Lannisport after burning their ships, gods, I'd have called you mad. Theon smiled thinly. A year ago, I was still just your father's ward, hoping to prove I wasn't an enemy. A lot has changed. Too much, Robb murmured. He ran a hand through his auburn hair. Sometimes I feel I've aged decades since the day Father was taken from us. If this truce leads to peace, will the North remain behind me, or will they resent me for not securing full independence? Theon hesitated. They declared you king. Some will want that dream fulfilled, no matter the cost. But others might accept near-total autonomy if it spares the North another wave of war. And if Sansa is freed, if you can bring her home, well, that's a victory in itself. Robb nodded, eyes dark with reflection. I won't abandon my crown easily. I swore an oath to the northern lords who crowned me. But I also can't ignore Sansa's plight or the suffering of my people. War is devouring us all. He turned to face Theon fully. No matter what happens, you've stood by me. You saved Winterfell, you captured your own sister, fought your own kin. When this ends, you'll have a place in the North truly. Theon felt a warm surge of gratitude that bordered on relief. I won't lie. Part of me still struggles with what happened at Pike. But I know where my loyalty lies. If the North can find peace, that's enough for me. Robb gave him a half-smile. "Thank you." They spoke a while longer of mundane matters, supply lines, the distribution of men through the city. As evening settled, Theon took his leave, meandering through the fortress. He wandered into a small garden enclosed by high walls. The sky overhead glowed purple with twilight, and a few battered rose bushes stood amid the flower beds. Theon closed his eyes, letting the hush wash over him. So much hung on these negotiations. If Tywin agreed to let the North go in all but name, it might end the war. Theon pictured Pike battered by storms, thought of Balon's refusal to yield. Even if the Lannisters and Starks reached terms, the Iron Islands might remain a threat. But if Balon persisted, Robb would eventually have no choice but to crush him. Perhaps that was Theon's fate, to stand with the wolves against the Krakens once and for all. He opened his eyes to see Roose Bolton standing at the garden's edge, silent as a wraith. The man's pale gaze flickered over Theon with unsettling calm. "You seem pensive," Bolton remarked, stepping closer. Theon forced a neutral expression. "Just thinking." Bolton nodded, glancing around the garden as if admiring its gloom. "War's demands are endless. Yet we might have peace soon. An interesting thought." "Interesting," Theon echoed. Bolton's lips curved in a faint smile. "The realm thrives on power and cunning. Peace is but a lull before the next crisis. Perhaps you, of all men, understand that. After all, you straddle two worlds." A prickle of unease crawled along Theon's spine. "I stand with the North." "Indeed," Bolton said smoothly. "That choice has profited you thus far. Let us hope it continues to do so." With that cryptic comment, he turned and walked away, the tails of his fur cloak trailing over the stone path. Theon exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. There was something about Roose Bolton, some quiet menace that unsettled him. But perhaps he was imagining it. Everyone in this war had secrets and hidden ambitions. Night fell and Theon tried to sleep. He dozed fitfully, haunted by dreams of crashing waves and echoing wolves. Morning came shrouded in mist. A hush lay over Lannisport, as if the city held its breath, waiting to see if the peace would last. By mid-morning, Catelyn Stark returned, leading a small group of riders. With them was Sansa Stark, pale, thin, dressed in a modest gown. She looked weary, her auburn hair dulled by stress. The city's folk watched in wary fascination as the men at the gates let her pass. The moment Robb saw Sansa in the courtyard, he leapt from his horse. She ran to him, half sobbing. Theon stepped aside, feeling a pang at the sight of their reunion. Catelyn dismounted more slowly, tears in her eyes. Sansa clung to Robb, trembling. He stroked her hair, whispering comfort. Catelyn joined them, hugging her daughter fiercely. For a moment, the war receded in the face of that tender reunion. Theon heard some of the northern soldiers murmuring prayers of thanks to the old gods. Even the great Jon wiped at his eyes, muttering about dust. When Sansa finally composed herself, she spoke in a trembling voice. "Arya, I never saw her after." She hesitated, tears brimming again. "They say she escaped. I pray the gods let it be so," Joffrey said. "He said horrible things." Robb's voice turned grim. "You're safe now, Sansa. No one will hurt you here. I'll keep you from the Lannisters forever, if I can." Catelyn embraced her again. "My sweet girl. We'll find Arya. We'll bring her home." They led Sansa inside, away from prying eyes. Theon watched from a respectful distance. The courtyard buzzed with excitement. This was the first tangible victory for House Stark that wasn't merely battlefield triumph. It was the return of a beloved daughter. Theon felt a measure of hope that perhaps the realm was shifting, that a negotiated peace might be possible. But that same day, the Lannister envoys arrived to collect Jaime. It was a tense affair. Jaime Lannister was brought out under heavy guard. He looked thinner, his beard scraggly, but he still carried himself with that old arrogance. Karstark stood at the forefront, glowering. Theon noticed the man's hand tighten on his sword hilt. Robb called for calm. Under the watchful eyes of 100 archers, Jaime was handed over to Kevan Lannister's men. Kevan, in turn, confirmed that Sansa had reached Robb safely. The trade was done. Karstark spat at Jaime's feet, muttering curses. Theon feared for a moment that violence might erupt, but Jaime only sneered slightly and marched out under guard. With that exchange complete, the armistice was truly in effect. Robb confided in Theon that Tywin had agreed, in principle, to allow the North Broad self-governance, but he refused to call Robb king. For the next fortnight, envoys would attempt to hammer out details. If they succeeded, the war might end with the North effectively independent but nominally part of the Seven Kingdoms, a compromise that left the question of Theon's father open. Balon Greyjoy's actions might require a separate negotiation. As the days wore on, negotiations dragged. Tywin demanded gold to compensate House Lannister for the destruction of Lannisport's fleet. Robb scoffed at that, pointing out how the Lannisters had invaded the Riverlands first and Eddard Stark had died by Joffrey's order. Back and forth it went. The tension in Lannisport refused to abate. Northern soldiers prowled the streets, bored and far from home, sometimes clashing with local toughs. Robb did his best to maintain discipline, but cracks appeared. One rainy morning, Theon was out inspecting the walls with a few guards when horns sounded in the western watchtower. He raced up the steps 2 at a time. The watchers pointed out across the fields. There, in the distance, a large contingent of riders was approaching, thousands, it seemed, banners streaming in the wind. Red and gold fluttered among them. Theon's stomach clenched. "That's the Lannister army." One of the guards looked grim. "But we have an armistice." "Armistice or no, it appears they're coming here," Theon said, voice taut. "Fetch the king at once." By the time Robb arrived at the watchtower, the approaching force had drawn closer. Even in the rain and mist, Theon could see the gleaming of armor, the shape of siege engines behind the cavalry. This was no token force. It was an entire host on the march. They bore the Lannister lion, but Theon also spotted other sigils, likely loyal vassals or hired swords. Robb's expression was thunderous. Tywin swore he wouldn't move closer than a day's ride. He breaks his word. Theon's mind churned. He might claim we broke some term or that the negotiations failed. Or he simply intends to take back the city by force, with no regard for the armistice. Robb's jaw tightened. So be it. We'll not let him walk in. Raise the defenses. Sound the horns. Call the men to arms. The watchers scrambled, horns blaring. A flurry of activity swept the city. Theon and Robb descended, issuing commands for archers to man the walls, for cavalry to prepare inside the streets. Sansa was whisked to the fortress for protection. The Greyjoy's men roared challenges, thirsting for another fight. By noon, the Lannister host was arrayed outside Lannisport, forming a semicircle with siege towers and catapults. Theon took position on a forward tower near the main gate, bow in hand. Rain slicked the stones, making every step treacherous. Dripping water cast a dreary pall over the bright lion banners fluttering in the distance. Trumpets sounded from the Lannister lines, and a single rider advanced, a herald. He halted within earshot of the walls, raising his voice. "Hear me, Lord Tywin Lannister, Hand of the King, demands that the northern host vacate Lannisport at once. Lay down your arms, or face annihilation." Angry shouts rose from the walls. Robb, standing beside Theon, called back in a voice that carried, "Your lord broke the armistice. We do not yield." The herald seemed unmoved. "Your king in the north is unrecognized by the Iron Throne. Surrender and beg mercy, or we'll show none." Robb responded by having one of his men loose an arrow that thunked into the ground near the herald's horse. The herald wheeled around and galloped back, the message delivered. A hush descended. Both sides knew the next action would be the thunderous crash of war. Theon felt his blood pounding. So Tywin had chosen treachery, or at least decided the time for talk was over. Perhaps the destruction of his fleet and the occupation of Lannisport was an insult he couldn't swallow. Now, tens of thousands of Lannister men prepared to storm the city that Robb held with maybe half that number. The horns sounded again, a dire wolf's howl from atop the city walls, answered by the brassy roar of lawn. Nista trumpets. In the distance, catapults rumbled forward, covered by lines of advancing infantry. Archers prepared to loose deadly volleys. Robb turned to Theon, face set like stone. "No matter what happens, we fight." Theon nodded. He remembered the day he knelt beside Robb and swore fealty to the king in the north. Now, they would see this war through to the bitter end. The walls thrummed with the heartbeat of hundreds of soldiers, the clang of steel, the ragged breathing of men who knew that dawn might not find them alive. Rain fell harder, drenching them all, but Theon barely noticed. He fitted an arrow to his bowstring, glancing once at Robb. The king in the north lifted his sword high, meeting Theon's gaze with unspoken resolve. Then the Lannisters charged, siege towers rolling, men shouting, horns blaring. Theon drew back his bow. Thunder cracked overhead. The war was not finished. The final, desperate struggle for the North's freedom and Theon's own place in this bloody tapestry had only just begun.